The same conclusion could pass one test of reasoning in one ancient setting and fail it in another. The difference did not lie only in the subject under discussion. It lay in the specific test the conclusion had to survive before it could be treated as established. In one tradition, the test was the arrangement of terms. If the pattern preserved necessity, the conclusion followed, regardless of whether anyone found it useful or already believed it. In another, the test required a reason, a general connection between that reason and the claim, and an example that both sides of a dispute could accept. In a third, the test turned on whether names were being applied consistently, judged against observation, inherited models, and consequences for social order. These were not three variations of one underlying method. They were three different mechanisms for constraining disagreement when no single authority could simply declare an end to it. This is before logic, a history of rules before they were written. Structured approaches to inference and argument evaluation emerged independently in the Greek philosophical tradition, the Indian Nyāya school, and the Mohist writings of early China. Each developed procedures for separating conclusions that could be defended from those that could not, under conditions where multiple competing accounts of the world were in play. The need to test consistency and to conduct disputes without constant collapse into assertion produced different solutions in each case. In the Greek tradition, the system that took shape in the 4th century BCE organized reasoning around categorical statements that linked a subject term to a predicate term. An argument could be reduced to two premises and a conclusion. Validity depended on the pattern of term distribution across those premises, not on the content of the terms themselves. Once a pattern preserved necessity, the conclusion followed from acceptance of the premises alone. The power of this approach came from its deliberate separation of form from content. A conclusion did not gain security because the subject was familiar, practically useful, or already accepted by the participants. It gained security only when the relation among the terms made it impossible to accept the premises while denying the conclusion. This required arguments to be reformulated into standard patterns before they could be evaluated. The same formal test could then be applied across different subjects, but only to statements that could be expressed in categorical form. The Indian Nyāya tradition placed different requirements on inference. Its classical presentation used 5 statements designed for explicit debate between opposing parties. The first stated the thesis to be established. The second identified the mark or reason present in the case. The third stated the general connection between that mark and the property to be proved, backed by an example drawn from shared experience. The fourth applied the connection to the case at hand. The fifth restated the thesis as now supported. The conclusion could not rest on formal pattern alone. It had to pass through a visible chain, a reason, a general relation, and an example acceptable to the opposing side. This made the path of inference explicit and therefore open to challenge at specific points. If the mark was not present, the inference collapsed. If the general connection could not be established, the inference collapsed. If the example was rejected within the dispute, the inference could not stabilize the claim. Generalization could advance only where prior agreement on instances already existed. The Mohist dialectical writings from early China addressed a different point of vulnerability, the instability of names and classifications. Disputation frequently turned on whether a particular object or action fell under one description or under its direct complement. The difficulty was not primarily one of formal structure or of finding an agreed example. It was whether names were being used consistently enough for judgment and conduct to remain stable across cases. The surviving material records explicit standards for constraining such disputes. These included alignment with practices attributed to ancient sages, confirmation through direct sensory observation, and evaluation of consequences in terms of benefit or harm to social order. The texts also preserve procedures for maintaining terminological consistency, distinguishing kinds according to sameness and difference, and extending or restricting the scope of a description without internal contradiction. Successful reasoning was therefore tied to regulated naming, observable confirmation, inherited models, and practical consequence, rather than to a form detachable from content. When these three approaches are placed side by side, the different boundaries they placed around acceptable reasoning become visible. The Greek system allowed evaluation by inspection of term structure alone, without requiring shared acceptance of examples or reference to practical outcomes. The Nyāya sequence made the movement from reason to conclusion explicit and therefore contestable, but it could not proceed without an example jointly recognized within the dispute. The Mohist procedure directly confronted the instability of classification and naming, but did not develop in the surviving record a separate test for the formal validity of an argument independent of substantive standards. Each tradition therefore stabilized reasoning at a different point. Greek syllogistic constrained the internal relations among statements. Nyāya constrained the movement from observed mark to general claim through an accepted example. Mohist disputation constrained the consistent application of descriptions to objects and actions. In each case, the mechanism limited where and how disagreement could continue without resolution. The surviving sources do not permit precise reconstruction of how these procedures were taught or adjusted in actual oral practice, nor do they establish whether comparable methods existed in settings that left no written record. Dating of the core compilations remains subject to ranges rather than fixed points. Claims of direct transmission or influence between the traditions before the Common Era lack supporting textual or archaeological evidence. The three developments are therefore treated as parallel responses to a shared structural pressure rather than as derivations from one another. The record indicates that consistent reasoning under conditions of disagreement did not converge on a single ancient form. Each tradition produced a repeatable framework suited to its own intellectual and institutional setting. A conclusion became stable only after passing through the particular vulnerability that framework was built to control: form, example, classification, or consequence. What counted as reasoning, therefore, depended not only on the claim being made, but on the kind of instability the procedure was designed to contain. In the next episode, we will examine time as a structural variable.